Hi there, my name is Madyson with Stanley & Associates, and today we are once again doing something on this channel that I like to call famous or infamous personal injury cases. Today we will be looking at the case of Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company. A very sad case that was completely avoidable, but as we have seen in the past, companies can sometimes cut corners and put profits over people. And in this case, that's just what happened. Now before we get started, I'd like to remind everybody to go ahead and like this video, watch some of our old ones, subscribe to our channel, and comment what cases you'd like to hear about in the future. Let's jump right into it. In November of 1971, Lily Gray and her husband bought a brand new 1972 Ford Pinto hatchback, and immediately they started having issues with this vehicle. After only a few months of owning it, they would have to take it back to the dealership for repairs multiple times. Some of the issues they were having with the vehicle included using too much gas and oil, the automatic transmission shifting down unexpectedly, a lack of power, and the occasional stalling. It was later found that the stalling and the excessive fuel consumption were caused by a heavy carburetor flow. Now, I'm definitely not a car girly. All I know about cars is how to drive an automatic, but I found in doing research for this video that even someone like me who really doesn't know all that much about cars could easily see that the 1972 Pinto hatchback was a disaster and would have definitely not flown by today's safety standards. But let's go back in time a little bit before Lily Gray and her husband ever bought that vehicle. In 1968, Ford began designing the Pinto. Lee Iacocca, who was VP of Ford at the time, said that Ford's main objective was to build a car at or below 2,000 pounds to sell for no more than $2,000, which in theory is cute, but it doesn't take a genius to know that you would absolutely have to cut costs and cut corners to make that an achievable goal, especially given that at the time in 1968, a brand new Ford vehicle was anywhere between $2,500 to $3,000, which if you would like to put that in today's standards, that would be trying to sell a vehicle for $18,000, which will usually go for $22,000 to $27,000. Later on in court proceedings, the Pinto would be described as a rush project and said that while standard auto industry practice was that engineering studies preceded the styling, in the case of the Pinto project, the styling preceded engineering and dictated engineering design to a greater degree than usual, which to me is just red flags. The Pinto's design put the gas tank behind the rear axle rather than above it, which was the standard for most foreign cars at the time. The Pinto only had 9 to 10 inches of crush space, the part of a car's body that absorbs crash energy if in an accident, lessening impact to the passengers inside. 9 to 10 inches being a lot less than American cars made at the time, and even less than some Ford vehicles at the time. And tragically, Lily Gray and Richard Grimshaw would both find out just how completely flawed these designs were. On May 28, 1972, Lily Gray, who was born January 11, 1920, and her passenger, 13-year-old Richard Grimshaw, who some sources say were neighbors, but not really sure, both set out in the Pinto from Anaheim on their way to Barstow to meet up with Lily's husband. Again, the relationship between Lily and Richard is kind of unknown. In my research, I couldn't find much, but again, I digress. The pair stopped for gas in San Bernardino and then headed back out to Interstate 15 at about 60 to 65 miles per hour. As she approached the congested Route 30 off-ramp, she jumped into the middle lane. Shortly after changing lanes, the Pinto just completely stalled and stopped on the highway. It was later discovered that the carburetor float had become saturated with gasoline, causing it to sink and flood the engine. A car directly behind Lily was able to swerve and miss hitting her. However, behind that vehicle was a 1962 Ford Galaxy that could not avoid colliding with Lily's vehicle. It was traveling around 50 to 55 miles per hour, but at the point of impact, it had slowed down to about 28 to 37 miles per hour. According to experts in court, the Galaxy caused Lily's gas tank to be pushed forward and pierced by something. And remember, because of the placement of Lily's gas tank, she only had about 9 to 10 inches of crush space before the tank became punctured. Fuel leaked from the gas tank into the passenger area, and this ultimately caused the Pinto to catch fire, and the interior was completely engulfed in flames with Lily and Richard still inside. They were able to get out of the vehicle with their clothes almost completely burned off. Richard did survive, but sadly, Lily passed away a few short days later due to congestive heart failure due to her burns. And of course, Richard did suffer severe and permanently disfiguring burns all over his body. He underwent numerous skin grafts and extensive surgeries, and still ended up losing portions of his fingers in his left hand and his left ear. Doctors estimated that Richard would need several surgeries over the next 10 years, and actually by the time Richard was 18, he had underwent 52 surgeries, which is absolutely tragic. I cannot imagine as a parent my 13-year-old son having to go through all of that. That is so traumatic and life-changing. After the accident, both Lily's family and Richard's family filed separate lawsuits against Ford Motor Company, but the actions were consolidated for trial, which basically means they were just put together in one trial. So we have spoken a little bit about the design flaws of the 72 Pinto hatchback, but when we consider the testing done on this vehicle and the continuation to distribute it to the public, it makes it so much more reckless. During the Pinto's development, many prototypes were tested. Some copied the design's mechanical parts, while others replicated the whole car entirely. These prototypes and 2 actual Pintos went through testing. This was to check the fuel system's safety in rear-end collisions and see if they met federal impact resistance rules. Cars made in 72 had to survive a 20-mile-per-hour crash test without the fuel tank leaking, and those made after 73 would have to undergo a 30-mile-per-hour crash test. Testing showed that the Pinto's fuel system failed the 20-mile-per-hour crash test. When being hit from behind at 21 miles per hour, the fuel tank moved and got punctured, causing fuel to leak out. In one test, the Pinto hit a barrier at 21 miles per hour, ripping the fuel neck from the tank and puncturing it with a bolt head, spilling fuel all over the driver's area. Ford also tested other cars, including Pintos with added safety features, that were able to pass the same test that the Pinto failed at the same speed. Vehicles with rubber bladders in their tanks, or with tanks above the rear axle, did not leak fuel when being hit at 21 miles per hour. When all was said and done, it was very clear that the Pinto that had the added safety features did not leak fuel. While Lily and Richard were hit by a vehicle at minimum going 28 miles per hour, I can't help but feel that they would have had better odds had there been these safety features, a rubber bladder, or having the fuel tank moved somewhere else above the rear axle. But I'm not a car girl, what do I know? Well, I'll tell you what the court knows. The courts determined that Ford sold the Pinto to the public without fixing any of its safety defects, even though it was standard practice for engineers to basically scrap the design, redesign, and retest until they could pass all their tests. And the real slap in the face is that these changes would have been virtually inexpensive to Ford at the time. Just to give you an idea of how inexpensive it could have been to Ford, I will go ahead and list out some of the changes and their prices. Longitudinal side members, $2.40 each. Cross members, $1.80 each. Shock absorbing flank suit for the fuel tank, $4. Tank within a tank and placement of the tank over the rear axle, $5.08 to $5.79. Nylon bladder within the tank, $5.25 to $8. Placement of the tank over the rear axle with a protective barrier, $9.95. Substitution of the rear axle with a smooth differential housing, $2.10. Protective shield between differential housing and fuel tank, $2.35. Improvement and reinforcement of rear bumper, $2.60. Additional 8 inches of crush space, $6.40. If we calculate all those changes at their highest price point, about $45 would have saved Lily's life and spared young Richard from being horribly burned. And just in case you were curious, by today's standards, $45 is about $340, which for Ford is not a lot of money at all, considering that in 1972 they brought in about $204 million in their fourth quarter, which I really don't need to convert that, but I'm gonna. $1,533,294,258 37 cents. I hope I said that right because I can't even conceptualize that amount of money. Needless to say, they could absolutely afford to have met those safety standards. Ford's Pinto project team, including vice presidents like Lee Iacocca, held regular meetings to review their product. In one meeting in April 1971, they discussed a report from Ford's engineers called Fuel System Integrity Program Financial Review. This report talked about crash tests and how much it would cost to redesign the Pinto so that the fuel safety standards were up to par. And it was suggested to wait on repairs to save money. Of course, Harley Kopp, a former Ford engineer, said that top management knew that the gas tank could easily break and catch fire, even in a minor rear-end collision. They were aware that affordable fixes were possible, but still continued to push out the Pinto that essentially was a death trap. Ultimately, the jury awarded $127.8 million in damages, $125 million in punitive damages, and $2,841,000 in compensatory damages to Grimshaw, and $665,000 to Lily's family. And I'm not doing any more conversions. If you want to see how much that would be in today's economy, go ahead, look it up yourself. It's a lot. You know it's a lot. It's a lot. And at the time, this was the largest amount of money ever rewarded in a personal injury case. The judge eventually lowered the punitive damages down to be $3.5 million, but it was still, at the time, the largest sum they've ever seen. Ford filed a motion for a new trial and was denied. Love that for them. And they contested the trial court's judgment on the basis of error, which includes erroneous or incorrect ruling related to Mr. Kopp's testimony, other erroneous evidentiary rulings, prejudicial misconduct by plaintiff's counsel, instructional errors, and jury misconduct. They were grasping at straws, I tell you what. And they contested the punitive damages on the grounds that there was an absence of malice. And as my final thought on this video, I just want to say, me, as someone who is not a lawyer, hurting somebody intentionally and creating a product that you know will eventually hurt somebody, not a matter of if, but a matter of when, and selling it to the public for financial gain, go pretty hand in hand if you ask me. Sure, you may have hoped that it wouldn't have come to this, or that if it did hurt somebody, it wouldn't be to this extent, but it did, and you knew it could. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I could not find out anything about Richard Grimshaw today, which is probably for the best because he probably just wants to live out his life and not think about what was probably the worst day of his life. But there you have it, Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company. My boss Dustin often says that court trials often lead to a change in standard, whether it is implementing a law to protect people or upping safety standards. I think this was a perfect example of that. Thanks again for stopping by, and do remember to like, subscribe, and comment down below any cases or any topics that you want to hear about. We'll see you in the next one.